Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Welcome back to my channel, everyone. Today we're going to be doing episode 2 of the series on solving trigonometric functions by applying the product rule. So in this particular video, you can see we have f of x equals cosine x over sine x, and we are supposed to differentiate this question. But the first thing we have to do is, what differentiation rule are we supposed to apply here? Well, we have a trigonometric function which involves two subfunctions, where the entire function involves one subfunction, numerator, divided by another subfunction, the denominator. So therefore, if we want to differentiate a function that involves a division, we have to apply something called the quotient rule. So when we compare this question here with this information here, which is just basically the general statement, right? When we can compare both of this, the actual question and this, we can therefore say that f of x in our question equals cosine x, okay? And then g of x in our question equals sine x. And yeah, that's the first part information. Now we have to apply the quotient rule in order for us to differentiate this question. The first thing you have to do is you're going to write out the quotient rule formula, which I've written here, which is the derivative of the first subfunction, which is the numerator subfunction, multiplied by the denominator subfunction, minus the derivative of the denominator subfunction g of x multiplied by the numerator subfunction. All of that information divided by the denominator subfunction. So when we do this, we can start so when we've written this down and we know we're going to apply the product, we can go ahead to start solving. So therefore, we have the derivative of cosine x divided by sine x to be the derivative of the first subfunction f of x, which is cosine of x, right? Multiplied by g of x, which is sine x, minus the derivative of g of x, which is the derivative of sine x right here, multiplied by f of x, which is cosine of x. So all of that information divided by g of x. What is g of x? We know g of x to be sine x, so divided by sine x all squared. So that's the first thing we have to do. Now to proceed, since we've already arranged our question according to the details in the quotient rule equation, we can go ahead to start actually solving mathematically. So we have equals to, what is the derivative of the first information here, cosine x? So if you're new to this channel, basically if this is the first video on my channel that you are watching, you probably don't know this, but every single time I am teaching something that requires a sheet of formula or a page or note filled with formulas, I always have that in the video. So for example, now since we're dealing with trigonometric functions, I have something that I always put in all my trig related videos called Trig Notes, right? So we have a Trig Notes here, and the Trig Notes is just basically a page filled with all of the trig functions and how they relate to one another, and also the derivatives of trig, as you can see in this particular Trig Notes. On the left hand side of this Trig Notes, everything written in blue on the left hand side shows trig expression, which involves how a trig function relates to another trig function. So you can see here that sine x relates to cosecant x relates to sine x, and their relationship involves reciprocality. The same way cosine x and secant x are related through reciprocality. The same way tan x and cotangent x are related through reciprocality. So on the right hand side at the top, everything in blue shows trig identities. So anytime you think of trig identities, think of trig that involves squares, like how things that have squares relate to one another. So not things, how trig functions that have squares relate to one another, like sine square x plus cosine square x equals 1. Like all of this information in Trig Notes actually helps you a lot to simplify your work, as well as in situations where you have to substitute in order to simplify your work. Then everything else reading in red marker, simple, just simply involves what they call it. It just involves trig derivatives. So everything in red marker are just trig derivatives. So now let's go to what we're asked to do. We were asked to find the derivative of cosine x. What is the derivative of cosine x? This is sine. We don't want it. Oh, we want it here. Derivative of cosine x, which is equals to negative sine x. So we're going to put a negative sine x here, right? Negative sine x multiplied by sine x, that is down here. So we'll put that down. All of that minus, what is the derivative of sine x? Let's go back to the previous page. When we check the derivatives part of the trig notes, we see the derivative of sine x is cosine of x, right? So multiplied by this other cosine of x, right? And all of that divided by our best friend here, which is just the denominator subfunction, which we know to be g of x, which we know to be sine x. So sine x, everything squared. So I'm just going to rewrite all that we have here on the next page. So we have negative sine x multiplied by sine x, right? Minus cosine x multiplied by cosine x. All of that information divided by sine x all squared. So you have negative sine squared of x, so sine x multiplied by sine x, right? Minus cosine squared of x, right? All of that information divided by sine x all squared, so sine squared of x. So therefore we have this. Now the thing we can do is we can simplify by bringing out a negative. So we can do negative sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x. All of that information divided by sine squared of x. So now that we have this, what is the next thing we're supposed to do? The first thing you need to know is that this answer right here, this entire information is very, very correct. This is your answer basically in quotient rule. Sorry, when you apply quotient rule to the function cosine x divided by sine x. But because we're doing trigonometric functions, it's not smart for you to leave your answer in a complicated way. So let's go back to our trig notes to see if there's a way for us to simplify the question in order for us to have a much neater answer. So when we go to the trig notes, we go compare. Well, if we look at trig expression, it's not wise to look at trig expression here because what we have involves like a plus in between important stuff, and also 1 over sine square x does not really have something else multiplied to it that we can maybe cancel out. So let's just look at the trig identities in the trig notes. So when we look, we don't want trig expression, so let's look at trig identities. Here we have sine square x plus cosine square x, and all of that, and that is equals 1. So I'm going to rewrite it here. Remember, from the trig notes what we just saw, sine square x plus cosine squared x equals 1. So now that we know that, and that is much simplified, we can just substitute it here. So instead of having negative into bracket sine squared x plus cosine squared x, right, we can just have this here and put minus 1 divided by sine squared of x. Now this answer is really good as well. Now this is also a good answer. Like I said, this is this new answer that we got is a more simplified version of the first answer where we got. But let's see if we can still do something to it. If we look at our trig notes, we see that On the side where we have trig expression, we see reciprocality. Our final answer here, the simplified version, has reciprocality. So what makes sense for us to actually look at? Let's look at the trig expression. So the trig expression, we have sin x equals 1 over cosecant x. That doesn't really help us much. But then we have cosecant x equals 1 over sin x. Oh my gosh. Well, we have 1 over sine squared x. So what are we supposed to do? Well, whenever you have trig expression, if the trig expression, sine squared x basically is 1 over, is the same thing as saying sine x multiplied by sine x. So 1 over sine x is the same thing as, 1 over sine squared of x is the same thing as 1 over sine x multiplied by 1 over sine x. So therefore, 1 over sine squared x, if we look at our trig notes, that's going to be the same thing as cosecant x multiplied by cosecant x. So therefore, we have our answer here, which I'm going to put in red, to be negative cosecant squared x. So therefore, this answer in blue box at the bottom is our final answer. So when we find the derivative of cosine x divided by sine x, our final answer is going to be negative cosecant squared x. So now I'm going to introduce you guys to the shortcut version of this question. And I want to teach you the shortcut version because there are some students that they do not do their professors design the schoolwork to involve like multiple exam structure. So not all of us have a professor that is just going to give you a question where you have to solve everything in detail. There are some professors that like to do multiple choice, and in multiple choice questions, shortcut methods are very, very helpful. So now we have this question, cosine of x over sine x. What do we do here? And we're asked to find the derivative of this question. So the thing we need to do is we need to actually simplify our question before deriving it. You know, in the long cut method where we were applying the quotient rule, we did not simplify, we just applied the quotient rule to this function, right? But the shortcut method involves simplifying the function and then going on to derive it, right? So what is cosine of x divided by sine x? Well. The simplified version of this is just to go to our trig notes. Maybe we can find the answer. So when we look at our trig notes, let's look at the trig expression. We see the trig expression, which is basically is how one trig function relates to another trig function, sine x, blah, blah. Sine x equals to 1 over cosecant x, cosecant x. So we have cosine x equals 1 over secant x. That doesn't help us much, doesn't help us. But when we look at tan x is the same thing as 1 over cotangent x, which is the same thing as sine x over cosine x. That doesn't still help us much. But when we go to cotangent, what do we have? Cotangent is the same thing as 1 over tan x, which is the same thing as cosine x divided by sine x. So therefore, our question where we have cosine x divided by sine x, we're going to substitute and put a cotangent in the middle. So basically, we're simplifying. So now we end up with this being equals to cotangent x. So therefore, the derivative of cosine x divided by sine x is the same thing as us looking for the derivative of cotangent x. Like, this is going to be so helpful to you in the multiple choice question, but you need to have mastered the trig notes and understood how the trig notes work. Like the notes at the beginning of this series of pages, I want you guys to really master the trig notes. If this is your first video, you probably do not know this, but I advise that you pause the video at the point where I talk about trig notes and you write it down. So you have the derivative of cotangent. Well, now it's simplified. What we just have to do is look for the derivative of cotangent x. What did we see the derivative of cotangent x? If we look at the bottom left of the screen, we see that the derivative of cotangent x is the same thing as negative cosecant x. So therefore, our answer becomes negative cosecant But I said cosecant x. That's wrong actually. When we go back and look at it, what we have is negative cosecant squared x. So we have negative cosecant squared x, and we're going to put our answer in red box. So this is our answer. So rather than the entire thing we just did, applying the product rule, identifying subfunctions and all of that stuff, we could have just broken it down and literally gotten our answer by doing the shortcut method and gotten negative cosecant x, and then we can compare our shortcut method to the actual answer. What did we get? Our actual final simplified answer is also negative cosecant x. So we can see that our quotient rule is correct, as well as our shortcut method is valid. Make sure you guys take good care of yourself. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe. And if you have questions, please send me your questions by putting it in the comment section. But you could also check the description box to see if your question has already been answered, so you don't have to ask it. And if it hasn't, just write it down. And if somebody else has asked a question you want to ask, please just like their question so that I can easily see it, inshallah. Make sure you guys take good care of yourself, and I wish you guys all the very best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I will see you guys on episode 3 of this series.